Chapter 10. Zone of Alienation. They drove through the quiet Sunday morning streets in Octavian's 2000 Toyota Camry. There was a hole in the floor mat where the heel of his foot rested next to the accelerator. But otherwise, he had maintained the car with a meticulous love. The outside waxed and polished, as if the paint were still dripping new. The inside dashed glossy and smooth. Not a single crack despite 17 years of solar radiation. Even the worn spot in the floor mat was more testament to his careful, precise nature, having placed his foot in the same place for 17 years without variance. The early 20th century buildings slid past through the window, mixed in with 19th century structures, a church, and a few grand Victorians. But with growing frequency, the homes were not well kept like the Corrigans. Some had boarded up windows, overgrown bushes, and condemned signs in the yards. This did not keep them from being occupied, as many boards had been torn away, and refuse lay scattered in the yards from squatters. The condemned buildings became more numerous as they neared the north edge of town. Property values declining with proximity to the disaster in the old town of Selah Station. The most thriving businesses were liquor stores, same-day check cashing services, and a Goodwill. A small forest grew up between two of the city blocks, large brick warehouses lining either side, the paint on their sides fading, their windows dusty and broken. Octavian provided some explanation. Before the disaster, most of the residential areas were on the island and the industrial areas here on the West Virginia side. But that changed afterwards as people migrated off the island. For a while, folks thought everything would just continue like they had before. But that is not what happened? Octavian frowned, slowing to take a turn, then letting the steering wheel slide through his hands. Sadly, no. Losing the island, the university, it was like the heart of the community was gone. The administrators tried to reopen the school, but they kept running into red tape from City Hall. Didn't help that the university president, Prentice Bridgewater, perished in the blast, along with a lot of the other town leaders. Without them, there was no one to take on the city bureaucracy. People lost patience, lost hope, and folks like us moved away. Octavian slowed as they approached a railroad crossing, the warning lights and traffic gates weathered and inoperable. The tracks themselves ran out onto a trellis that spanned the Potomac River Gorge before reaching Selah Island itself. The island was imposing, with no beach to speak of. It met the water with sheer cliff walls, dark eddies of currents swirling at their base. The foliage was thick, but through the trees she could spy buildings hiding. The shingles green with moss or brown with years' worth of fallen leaves. The walls were stained and weather-beaten. She referenced the map Octavian had given her before and looked at the place where she expected to see the campus, but she saw nothing but treetops. How long had it been? 50, 60 years? Time enough for the forest to take root. The northern end was also lost in growth, but the trees were noticeably smaller, as if the area had been clear-cut decades before. In a way, it had been, with the explosion and fire. Like the mast of a shipwreck, a rusted steel tower jutted out at an angle from the trees. Next to it, what looked like the remnants of a catwalk and conveyor belt twisted up into the air, as if leading to some platform that was long destroyed. Perhaps the various sections had been connected at one time, but no more. Jagged metal struts poked out like broken teeth into the gaps now. A crow perched on the ragged remnants of a handrail. Indifferent to the devastation, he shook out his wings, turned his head from side to side, and surveyed his domain like a raven in a graveyard. The train trellis was also rotting, the paint peeling in flakes the size of autumn leaves. revealing rusted metal beneath. The sleeper ties were in different stages of decay. Some had disintegrated completely and fallen into the river below. Others, while intact, had become covered in mushrooms and moss that had proven resistant to the preservatives and tar leaching from their splitting sides. Parallel to the trellis ran a two-way roadway bridge. That was how they would cross, but they would not be driving. The entrance was blocked by jersey walls and 2 layers of chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Red and white signs barred unauthorized entry in alarming capital letters. Yellow signs with skulls and crossbones announced deadly toxins, and carcinogens with smaller black writing listing the legal statutes against trespassing and the accompanying penalties. Good thing you got me to sign all those forms before I saw these warning signs. I might not have agreed, Kenia said, only half joking. You know lawyers, always overly cautious, Octavian said, opening the Camry door. A green building with a corrugated tin roof and tin chimney sat next to the gate, its windows facing the roadway. The narrow door in one side opened and an elderly man in blue slacks and a gray jacket with state and city patches sewn on it stepped out as they got out of the Camry. Before the door closed behind the man, Kenia glimpsed a tiny room with a portable television and a seat repaired with packing tape. Morning, Buzz, Octavian said, closing his car door. Octavian, the man said. He had reached an age of intermediate number. He could have been in his 50s or 70s. He was an average-sized man, a bit bent with age. His face had a hard, chipped look to it, like the edge of an old axe. His skin was sallow and spider-webbed in parts, with purple blood vessels. His small, colorless eyes looked up and down Kenia's figure, his attention lingering for a moment on her chest, making her wish she had worn something besides a tank top. Buzz, this is Kenia. She's interning at the MedDem building this summer. I thought I would give her a tour of the old town. Kenia, this is Buzz Grimsby, gateman of Selah Island. Morning, Buzz said, unashamed as his eyes dipped from Kenia's face and back to her chest again. Kenia was relieved when Octavian went to the trunk of the Camry, pulled out the hazmat suits, and handed one to Kenia along with the breathing apparatus, air filter, and bucket-like helmet. She unzipped it without waiting and began to step into it, Buzz still watching her. You a student? Yes, she said, taking note of how Octavian sealed his suit. The material was some blend of vinyl and spandex that would keep toxins out, but would certainly not breathe. She understood now why Octavian had told her to dress lightly and come early in the morning. It would be hot inside it. She sign all the papers? Buzz asked. Octavian reassured Buzz that she had, answering with a yes, sir, that Kenia found distasteful for some reason, perhaps because it seemed to appease some assumption on Buzz's part regarding his authority. It was nothing spoken, just something that hung in the air, implied. She almost expected the old man to call Octavian boy. Buzz Grimsby sniffed, losing interest in her now that her body was concealed by the suit. No removing any artifacts, no opening your suit, taking off your helmet or gloves, he said, with all the indifference of a flight attendant rehearsing a well-worn set of instructions, his demeanor only shifting when he said, and absolutely no unauthorized visits to the northern end of the island. Octavian, used to the litany of warnings, said, Got it, from within his helmet, as he checked the seals on Kenia's, then helped her shove her feet into oversized rubber boots. Ma'am, Buzz said, moving closer, an edge of intimidation in his voice. He was animated now, his pleasure in exercising his authority clear. "I need verbal acknowledgement from you that you have heard and understood the restrictions." "I acknowledge it," Kenya said, waiting for a defiant beat, while she pushed her foot into her boot. "All right," Buzz said, the keys on his belt jingling as he shook the ring until he could pinch the one between his fingers that opened the gate. "Thanks, Buzz," Octavian said, his tone still light and airy, as they passed through the chain-like fence, walked around the Jersey walls, and made their way down the middle of the road, the fading double yellow line running between them. The suit was stuffy and cut Kenya off from the fresh air, the sound of the river rushing below and the morning birds above. Her own breathing through the respirator was loud. Their voices were strange, Octavian's muffled, her own echoing in her helmet. Then, of course, there was the constant sound of the suit's material rubbing against itself as she swung her arms and moved one leg in front of the other. She was certain this was what it felt like to walk around in a spacesuit. Out over the expanse of the river gorge and far from old Buzz's hearing, Kenya turned to Octavian. "You always like that?" "Who?" "Buzz Grimface back there, the troll of the bridge?" "Buzz Grimsby?" Octavian chuckled. "Pretty much. Takes his job seriously. He's harmless, though." "I'm not so sure," Kenya said, turning to look back at the gate. Buzz was gone, back into his guardhouse. He sure seemed to feel a bit of privilege back there. Is that representative of most of the white folks in Selah Station? She could see Octavian's brow furrow through his visor. "White privilege is just about the only privilege folks around here get. They are salt of the earth people out here. You noticed, the town isn't exactly thriving. Buzz, he's from a different generation, a dying one. Still, he was not exactly hospitable. This is West Virginia, all the charm of the North and the efficiency of the South." JFK said that about Washington, D.C. And like JFK's, D.C., Selah is very much about that space between the ideal and the real, he said, looking into the island, his eyes lifted. They continued, suits swishing and their boots squeaking. She already felt warm. "This place is a real passion for you, isn't it?" "Of course. Selah is an emblem, as much as a place where a community was committed from early on in this country's history to integration, Black liberation, and education." "But it was a failure," she said, her words soft and slow. She was unsure how he would react. "A beautiful failure," Octavian replied, undeterred. "If Edison had stopped because he failed 999 times at the light bulb, we would not have the illumination that came with the 1,000th successful try." "You really believe that?" Kenya said. "It's like James Baldwin says, perhaps it is the very struggle in America to come to grips with its imperfections, its injustices, its racial contradictions and conflicts that will ultimately be valuable. A source of strength, wisdom, resilience, enlightenment even." "You are one optimistic brother." "I have to be. Now, I have been remiss. I need to start the tour. What do you know about Selah's founding?" "That it was founded by some abolitionists from Buffalo who wanted to create an economy that was not based on slave labor." "Right. The leader of that group was a Reverend William Bridgewater. The original name of the town was Carter Rock. The model was a moderate success, with mining and river transport being reliable industries here. It led to a more equitable society, but the profits were not necessarily as huge. So, the southern plantation owners were not persuaded? No. And they, of course, were reluctant to give up their power. Like Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without demand. It has to be taken because it won't be granted without struggle, Kenia said, also paraphrasing Douglass. And we still see how an inequitable distribution of power and resources causes problems today. Historically, in the worst cases, it leads to nativist demagogues and dictators as people split into factions, almost tribal-like. Works in African countries, Kenia said, reflecting on what she knew of the politics of many of them. Then there is, of course, Le Pen, Duterte, Trump, Brexit, all buoyed by nativist sentiments. This is going to be a more interesting tour than I thought. You are well read, Octavian said, but we digress. So the growth of the original town was disrupted with the outbreak of the Civil War. But even before then, Carter had become a stop on the Underground Railroad. Its proximity to Maryland, the profusion of boats in and out of the docks, and the multiple bridges made for a porous border, excellent for smuggling runaway slaves, conductors, and supplies. Kenia nodded, stepping over an expansion joint in the bridge, the gap giving her a glimpse of a pylon rising from the water that had become home to a hawk's nest. At this point, it was no longer William Bridgewater, but his sons Reginald and Leonard who were running things. And that was when they met Selah Branch. Selah Branch was a person? I thought it was part of the Potomac River. Octavian nodded, a raconteur who knew he had hooked his audience. Yes, most people think that, but Selah Branch was a conductor. She was part of the gens de couleur libre. Free people of color descended from families that had once been part of the French and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and American South that found themselves part of the United States after the Louisiana Purchase. Selah Branch's own parents in New Orleans were slave owners, as some well-off gens de couleur were. Many women of color of her generation in New Orleans could aspire to be business owners or the mistress of a white man. But she turned her back on it all, rebelling against the institution of slavery and her family. Instead, she ventured out of New Orleans and became a conductor. Why have I never heard of her? Good question. She liberated many people, possibly more than Harriet Tubman. But like so many of Selah Station's history, her story was buried, forgotten. Octavian picked up a few leaves that had blown to the center span of the bridge and leaned over the side to drop them into the long, empty space over the water. By all accounts, Selah Branch was fierce, courageous, indomitable. He turned to Kenia, not to mention beautiful, statuesque, and iron-willed. Reginald and Leonard Bridgewater both fell in love with her, accompanying her on a number of journeys to free slaves, where the brothers would pose as their owners. Many adventures were shared, but in the end it was Leonard she fell in love with. Octavian turned, one eyebrow raised. War came after that, not just in the country, but in the Bridgewater family. Leonard and Selah married, a union that was illegal at the time, of course. Reginald did as well, to some well-to-do heiress, but already the families had become rivals, not friends. During Reconstruction, Leonard, Selah, and their children worked for unity and reconciliation. They had a vision of a diverse community, a diverse country, not unlike their own family. It was their son, David Solomon Bridgewater, a mayor, who went on to officially name the city after his mother and found the university. They neared the end of the bridge, where a second series of signs warned them anew of trespassing violations, carcinogens, and the structural insecurities of old buildings. Octavian paid them no attention, continuing with his story. Meanwhile, Reginald's children, as if out of spite, established the coal processing plant on the opposite end of the island from the university. They withdrew from the town, establishing that estate on the hill you see there. Octavian pointed south. From where they stood on the bridge, Kenia could see a section of mountainside previously hidden by the buildings of the town. The mansion, its front facade flat and austere, looked more institutional than residential. It was built with stone, the color of lead, presenting a stern face to the town below. The expansive slopes around it were clear-cut and a deep green-blue with Kentucky bluegrass. Kenia could see the shapes of additional outbuildings that populated the sprawling grounds. Octavian continued. For a long time, there seemed to be an uneasy truce between the two branches of the Bridgewater family, represented by the family associated with the university and the side of the family associated with the coal plant. The school and the plant were integrated among black, white, brown, and red folk. Students, whatever their race, could do apprenticeships at the plant or in the company that ran it. They were making their way onto the island now, Kenia recognizing the time capsule quality of the place immediately. The first building they passed, an old filling station, was mid-century America preserved, with 2 antique Esso pumps, and a sign advertising Minuteman service and another guaranteeing new power and new discovery with a tune-up of your car. The rubber of the hoses was disintegrated, the window into the pump's gauges opaque with weathering. A quart oil dispenser lay on its side, its metal rusted to the point of lace. Next to it, a Coca-Cola case still contained bottles of the black soft drink. But if these remnants were important to Octavian's narrative, he did not say so. Instead, he pushed onward with the story and down the road. But all that came to an end with the 1953 disaster. Like I said in the car, after the explosion and the contamination, Selah sort of lost its soul. And the only Bridgewaters left were Crowley Bridgewater, the plant owner, and his family, who had been safe up in their mansion the night of the accident. And they did little to help after. Some folks even speculated that it was Crowley who was behind all the resistance in City Hall to reestablishing the university on the mainland. Why would he do that? Old family rivalries, maybe, or just out of spite for losing his plant. But no one ever proved anything, just talk as far as I'm concerned. They moved down the road, coming to what had been the original town center until the 1950s, passing hardware stores, hairdressers, diners, and banks. Everything had an abandoned, in a hurry air about it, the signs of daily living still evident despite the encroachment of nature. The decaying hulks of 1950s-era cars sat curbside on their rims, banks of debris, fallen tiles, broken shingles, decomposing leaves, piled against the foundations of buildings. There's still money left in those banks? Kenia asked as they passed through a cross street, a stoplight still hanging, creaking in the wind. Their sealed suits, the sense of traveling back in time, the looming presence of an apocalypse, all made her feel like she was in a Hollywood movie. Yes, contaminated with chlorofluorine, of course. This is the oldest undisturbed zone of its kind, twice as old as the Chernobyl Zone of Alienation. Great place for biologists and toxicologists to study. Zone of Alienation? Most call it the restricted zone, but alienation is a closer translation to the Russian. Sounds like a novel by Albert Camus. Octavian turned at the shoulders to look at her through the visor of his suit. Anyone ever tell you that you sound like an Ivy League undergrad? Anyone ever tell you that you sound like an Ivy League professor? On occasion, he said, his smile flashing through his visor. They walked without words, the desolation imposing silence. They passed through more intersections, through more empty but not empty streets. Bushes grew out of cracks in the pavement, trees from the roofs, gutters, and drain spouts of buildings. Other roofs had collapsed, leaving a tangle of rafters, shingles, and young foliage sprouting up in what was once a room. When they reached the town square, it was clear to Kenya that at one time it would have been quaint and quintessentially American. The original courthouse had a clock face set up on the frieze over Ionic columns. A brick building with lettering over the door that indicated it was the city hall stood catty-corner. Bookstores, drugstores, restaurants, a police station, and a tourist burrow filled in the spaces between. In the center of the square was what had once been a grassy park, a statue standing amid a fountain in the center. The fountain had long ago turned into a fetid swamp, and the park a meadow choked with summer growth. The marble statue was green with lichen and moss, staring resolutely out into oblivion. "That is David Solomon Bridgewater, founder of the university," Octavian said, pointing to the statue. "Over there, in front of the mayor's office, you can see where the review stand was set up. The day of the explosion was also the day the people of Selah Station were welcoming home their boys who had fought in Korea. One of the only integrated platoons at the time." Kenya realized that what she had thought was white bunting hanging on the wreckage of the review stand actually had the faintest remnants of red and blue. A cat walked across a slanted bleacher. "Watch the cats," Octavian warned. "They are feral. They don't like people, and you don't want them to claw your suit. Chlorofluorine is not something you want to take home with you." "Can you see it? The chlorofluorine?" "It's colorless, and it's absorbed into most of the things around us now. Initial contact of low dosages causes tingling and burning, but the longer-term effects, including cancer, memory impairment, even changes to your personality, increased depression, irritability, aggression, are not too different from mercury poisoning." "Just worse, if I recall from the warning leaflet you gave me. Where did the cats come from?" "Left over from the house cats abandoned in the evacuation. Their lifespans are cut short by the poisoning, and they are meaner for it as well. There was even a pack of feral dogs for a while, but they were becoming too aggressive and dangerous. Only about a decade after, the evacuation hunters were brought in to trap, poison, or shoot them all." It was hard not to feel overwhelmed by the ruination. Hot dog, ice cream, and cotton candy stands were still set up on the sidewalks. Her foot kicked a doll, its clothes mere flecks of fabric, its plastic body faded to a sickly shade of alabaster. The weights behind its eyes were still intact, however, moving its eyelids so that it blinked, startling Kenya despite herself. "Come on," Octavian said. "I'll show you the college."